Hi everyone, this is the first video and goes alongside the handout for interval fundamentals and melody fundamentals. So what I recommend you do for these videos is always have the handouts printed out and be at a desk so you can write. And also be in such a situation where you can pause the video along the way because I'm going to be asking you some questions in some of these spots here. And what you can do is you can pause the video and then work on it, and then I'll give you the answer. So don't just let me answer them without you trying them first. All right, so this first video, let's start off with the material on the intervals. I'll go through this along the way and do some demonstrations. Now, I assume that most of you already know most of this stuff, so I'm mostly going to be just going over some definitions and terminology to make sure that we're all on the same book. All right, interval, as you know, the distance between two pitches. So that would be an example of an interval. And as you know, the labeling of intervals contains two bits of information. One would be the size. So that would be an example, so second, fifth, seventh, and so on. The interval I just played, C to E, is an example of a third, because it spans 3 letter names. And then also, here's just where some terminology comes in, the quality. We basically have 5 different qualities that intervals can be. They can either be perfect with a P, we use a P. They can be major, uppercase M, minor, lowercase m. Diminished, you can either use a little circle or you can use a D. And then augmented, where you can use a plus sign or an uppercase A. I like to use the small circle and the plus sign. All right, now next is material that I think most of you already know, but just let me go ahead and go over it real quick. First off, how to spell and recognize intervals of different qualities. There are very many different ways you can go about doing this. So one I'm just going to mention is to use the major scale as a reference point. This is something that's quite useful, at least for beginning students, which most of you already know this. If you look at a major scale here, for where they have the C major scale written out here, and then they have various intervals built above the tonic pitch here. And one thing you can learn is that in a major scale, it gives you both major and perfect intervals. It gives you all the perfect intervals, perfect 1, which is the perfect unison, perfect 4th, perfect 5th, and the perfect octave. As we're going to learn, those are your very, very stable sounding intervals. And it also gives you major intervals. Basically, anything else built from the tonic, above the tonic pitch, is a major interval. So you have the major second, the major third, the major sixth, and the major seventh. So that gives you all your major and perfect intervals. In addition, minor intervals, you get those by decreasing the size of major intervals by a half step. So if you wanted to write, for example, a minor third, as you know, what you can do is just decrease the size of this interval by a half step, which you can do by either lowering the E to E flat, that will give you a minor third, or you could also do that by raising the lower pitch by a half step, C sharp to E. That's a minor interval. Again, I assume most of you already know this. To get augmented intervals, you're going to increase the size of a major or a perfect interval by a half step. So if I wanted to change this fourth to an augmented interval, I just make it a half step bigger. So instead of this, C to F, I go C to F sharp, and that gives me an augmented fourth. Similarly, if I was using the major third as my reference, if I want to make this into an augmented third, well, that's a very rare interval to begin with, but just from a spelling standpoint, that will be C to E sharp. Again, spelling-wise, that will be called an augmented third. And then diminished is essentially kind of the reverse. You decrease the size of a minor or a perfect interval by a half step. So for example, if I wanted to create let's say, a diminished fifth. So let's say I wanted to create a diminished fifth. I can do that by going C to G flat, or I could also do that by raising the C to a C sharp. I'm just making the interval smaller, and that will make it diminished. All right, now I mentioned another method that could be quite useful for intervals that I'm sure most of you know, which is to memorize the number of half steps that you have in each interval label. So for example, it's quite good to know that a perfect fifth is 7 half steps, and then know how all of the intervals relate to each other. If you know that a perfect fifth is 7 half steps, then you know that a minor sixth is 8 half steps, and so on. But I don't want to spend too much time on this because I figure most of you know that already. All right, now a couple other things that could be useful to know about intervals, one of which is interval inversion. Now, the basic definition of interval inversion is when you take the lower note of an interval and you place it above the higher pitch, or you do the reverse. That will mean you invert the interval. So, for example, if I take this perfect fifth, C to G, and I take the lower note and I put it above the higher note, I've just inverted the interval. I could have done the exact same thing by taking the perfect fifth, taking the lower note and moved it down an octave. I get the same sort of idea. So that's what it means to invert an interval. So what happens when you invert an interval? Well, one is that the size of the interval changes. And one thing to remember, if you don't already know this, is that the size of the inverted intervals will always sum to 9. So a unison becomes an octave, seconds become sevenths, thirds become sixths, fourths becomes fifths, and in reverse. Also, the interval qualities change when you invert them. Perfect intervals stay the same. So for example, when I went to that perfect fifth to perfect fourth, that's fifth to fourth, so the size changes, but they're both perfect intervals. That does not change. For the other types of intervals, though, they change. Major becomes minor, and vice versa, and augmented becomes diminished. So now there's various ways you can use this information. One I mentioned here is that it can be useful for spelling large descending intervals. So, for example, let's do question 1. Again, you can pause you can pause the video once I ask this question. How could you use your knowledge of interval inversion to spell an augmented sixth below the note C sharp? Augmented sixth. Go ahead and pause the video. Okay, so how would you go about doing this? Well, here's what you would do. This is going to be a very difficult interval to spell below C sharp. What you could do, though, is think, what is the inversion of an augmented sixth? The answer is a diminished third. Now, a diminished third is not so difficult to spell, but you have to think about this. Since we were trying to do below, we're going to think about the diminished third above it. So what is a diminished third above C sharp? Well, a minor third is C. So a diminished third would be E flat. The minor third would be E. And so therefore a diminished third would be E flat. So if C sharp to E flat is a diminished third, we know that if I did this in reverse and took that E flat down an octave, that would give us our augmented sixth. So therefore, C sharp down to E flat will be an augmented sixth. All right, so there we go. All right, let's go ahead and move on to our next page. One more interval issue I wanted to mention. This is going to be extremely important in our next lesson, which is consonant and dissonant intervals. This is very, very important. Consonant intervals are those that sound stable, all right? Now, and they divide into 2 categories. First off, we have the perfect consonances. And this would only be, you can only have perfect consonances with the following intervals: unisons, octaves, and fifths, and then now fourths also, but that's a special situation. Now these are the most stable sounding intervals: your unison, your octave, your fifth, and your fourth. Very, very stable, very, very hollow sounding. And therefore, they usually don't permit any movement. They're very, very static. They kind of keep the music static. Now, conversely, I'll come back to the fourth in a little bit, but let's say for now, it is, as far as the label goes, a perfect consonance. Now, then we also have the imperfect consonances here, and that would simply be any major or minor third or sixth. These ones allow for a lot more melodic fluency. Major, minor, thirds, and sixths. Those are the ones that kind of are also very stable sounding, but they're not as stable as the perfect ones, so they permit a lot more melodic motion. Now, then what remains are going to be all of the dissonant intervals. These are the unstable intervals and the ones that require resolution. So essentially in this category, we have any, second, and seventh. Anything that says second and seventh, those are going to be very dissonant sounding. Anything that says augmented and diminished, those are going to be dissonant, right? That was an augmented fourth or diminished fifth. Something like, well, it depends on context to really even tell that you have that. Now, then the last one's kind of special, perfect fourth. This is actually going to be considered dissonant, but only when it occurs above the bass, all right? This is kind of an interesting fact. We'll find this in our next lesson. But if I just play a fourth, sounds pretty stable to me, but if you put it in a context where that's occurring above the bass, it often sounds dissonant. For example, I'm going to put my phone here for a second. If I did this, hear that fourth, right here, that's being produced. That sounds unstable to me. I want to hear it go down, right? So that's one example of where a fourth, if it happens above the bass, will sound dissonant. All right, now that we've done that, let's do a quick activity to wrap up our discussion of intervals. This is question 2. So you're going to follow the directions here. This is a real musical excerpt. And in the boxes, you're going to fill in the missing pitches based on the requested interval. And you're going to use the durational value that will fill in the measure. Now notice there's a few things that are mistakes in the original sheet. One is that instead of a minor seventh below violin 2, do a diminished seventh. And then for this last one, for L, the interval they're talking about is this note in the second violin. All right, so go ahead and pause the video now and try this out on your own, then I'll show you the answers. Okay, now that we're ready, I'm going to go and show you my answers. I'm going to zoom in on this as best I can. Let me just kind of show you from the beginning. Check your answers. Okay, so this is what I got. While you're looking this over, I'm going to play you the musical example. All right, here we go. Okay, there we go. All right. So now that we've covered intervals, let's go on and move to our next page in the handout. Now we're going to talk about melody. This material is actually going to be more relevant to the next lesson plan. It's just going to get us started with some very basic ideas about how to write a simple melody in even note values. This is eventually going to be what we call a cantus firmus, and when we're going to be writing first species counterpoint, we're going to kind of follow these guidelines. They're very, very simple, but really, really important for understanding tonal music. So let me first go through these, and then we're going to look at some musical examples and see how they conform to these ideas, or maybe in some cases how they differ. Now again, keep in mind that we're talking about a very simple situation here. This is not meant to apply to more complex melodies. All right, number one, the range of a melody. In general, maximum of a tenth. A tenth is a compound third. Usually much smaller though, because we're going to be singing these melodies, so you want them to stay pretty small, fifth or sixth. The pitch collection, again, we're very simple at this point. We're just going to stay diatonic, stay within the key signature. If you're in a minor key, you will raise scale degrees 6 and 7, but only at the cadence point. All right. Later on, we'll use those scale degrees more freely, but for now, we will only use those raised 6 and 7 at a cadence point, the melodic minor idea. So if you're kind of going along in A minor with the melody, that kind of idea. When you get towards the very ending of it, that's when you're going to do the raised 6 and 7. Otherwise, you're going to kind of stay within the key signature. Beginnings and endings, you're going to begin on notes of the tonic triad. So begin on scale degrees 1, 3, or 5. At the ending, you're always going to end on 1. And you're going to approach the final scale degree 1 by step, either from above or below. Therefore, if you're in the key of C major, at the very ending, you're either going to go Re, Do, or you're going to go Ti, Do. Now, if you're writing a bass melody, they really need to start on scale degree 1 because you have to indicate what the tonic is. So as far as a bass goes, you have less leeway for the starting pitch. All right, melodic shape. Here's the next thing to think about. Keep your melodic shape clear and simple. Generally use the shape of an arch. All right, so an arch kind of, gradually kind of moves up and then down. Try to have a clear climax pitch that is not repeated if at all possible. So the arch-like shape is sort of your most preferred shape for a melody. Next up, stepwise motion versus leaps. Try to let stepwise motion prevail, making it easy to sing, but also use some leaps for variety. Number 6, direction. Try to change direction at least more than once, otherwise it's going to be a very boring melody. Repetitions, this is going to be less important for real melodies, but for the most part, try to avoid repeating the same pitch too much so that it dominates the texture. And also try to avoid repeating groups of notes. That one's not too important. Now, probably the absolute most important thing on this sheet is number 8, treatment of leaps. This is going to be really important for species counterpoint. So avoid any dissonant leaps. So that means no sevenths. Don't use any augmented intervals. Now, you are allowed at some times to use leaps of diminished intervals, but they must be, I think I should have said I guess actually in another case, they have to be balanced by a step in the opposite direction. You cannot do leaps of augmented intervals. Because the whole idea is anytime you have a dissonant interval, it needs to be, or a dissonant leap, it needs to be balanced by motion in the opposite direction. But if I go F to B, see how that B wants to go to the C? That means I didn't fill in that leap. But if I did the reverse, F down to B, that's a diminished interval, diminished fifth. See how that can then go in the opposite direction and create a leap down and then a step up? that one is allowed. So that only works for diminished intervals, but it does not work for augmented intervals. Now B, avoid leaps larger than an octave. Generally, try not to get your leaps larger than a sixth. Of course, you don't want to leap sevenths to begin with. Leaps larger than a third should be followed by motion in the opposite direction, okay? So a leap, by the way, is anything that's a third or bigger. So steps are just by second. If you have a leap by third, you can continue in the same direction. That's fine. Even then, I kind of like to balance it in. But anything bigger than a third, a fourth, I want to reverse direction. And ideally, I also would prefer if you would step. This is what we call gap fill. Anytime you create a big gap, I want to reverse direction. If I went down by fourth, I didn't want to step up to fill in that space. So that's a very, very important melodic feature, the idea of gap fill. All right, finally, this is the last one. Do not write two consecutive leaps in the same direction unless the leaps outline a major or a minor triad. So if you're going to have two leaps in a row in the same direction, let's say that. Now that would be an error, C, E, B, because it did not outline a triad, right? If I'm going to leap twice in the same direction, it needs to outline either a major or a minor triad. So if I did this and wanted to leap again, this would be okay, because that's leaping through a major triad. If I did, that's okay as well, because I have two leaps in a row, but they're forming a C major triad. You can also do that with the minor triad. So basically don't do anything crazy like, something like that. That would not be outlining a major or a minor triad. All right, there we go. That's all I have for you there. Let's go ahead and look a little bit at some musical examples. This is going to be your next question. Let's just do the first one of these. Looking at A and B below. So by the way, these are examples of a cantus firmi or a cantus firmus. We're going to see this in our next lesson plan. And this is sort of the model for a melody. Let's look at the very first one, A, the one by Schenker. By the way, we're using the alto clef here. Let me play this for you and tell me how this melody conforms to to the guidelines of a melody. Okay. Pause the video and think of some answers to this. Okay, what would I say in this case? Number one, it's diatonic. It stays with the pitch collection of C major. It begins and ends on scale degree 1. So again, you have to begin on a note of the tonic triad. You have to end on scale degree 1. The melody is mostly by step, but there are a few leaps for variety. The melody has an arch-like contour. Notice, again, it's going to be kind of gradually working itself up as the arch-like contour. It gradually worked itself up to this climax pitch right here, and then it gradually worked its way back down. Now, finally, there aren't too many leaps here, but it is interesting that that one of the leaps is balanced. So actually, there are no leaps bigger than a third here. But this leap here of the third is balanced in. I feel like that one works even better, whereas this one is just a little bit awkward. It's allowable. You have a leap of a third, so you don't have to follow in the same direction. But that one I think you probably found sounded a little bit more awkward. But if you look at some of these other ones, anytime there's a large leap, notice how it's always filled in. Like right here, we have a leap down of a fourth, and then you reverse direction. Here, the leap up of a fifth, and you fill in that space. That's the whole idea of gap fill. All right, let's take a look at a couple more melodies on the next page. These are going to be some more real melodies, if you will. Let's start off with one that's not so good. Let's look at this one here, A, and tell me some of the errors that you see. I'm not even sure if I can play this, but right, so go ahead and write down some, pause the videos and write down some errors that you notice. Okay, now that you've had got some ideas, here's what I might say. Number one, it does not begin and end on notes of the tonic triad, right? This is meant to be C major. It does not stay diatonic. We throw in some random accidentals there, so it does not stay diatonic. It does not have an arch-like contour. It does not mostly have steps. It has lots and lots of leaps. And now you really can't trace out an arch contour here. And notice the climax pitch, we don't work up to it. We just kind of leap into it randomly. Now, really the biggest mistake here, though, among all those things, is going to be the treatment of leaps. You'll notice how many leaps don't get filled in. I think this spot here is the most egregious example of this. We have first off, the 2 leaps in a row that don't outline a triad, a major or minor triad, and neither of those dissonant leaps, this is actually a augmented 5th and a diminished 5th, neither of them gets filled in by motion in the opposite direction. So many, many errors here. Now, conversely, let's take a look at a real musical example. Let's look at the Mozart Magic Flute example and just show you how these same ideas might apply to this. So what are some of the good things about this melody? Sorry. All right, so pause the video for a moment and think about what you like about that melody. Okay. Well, what we'll notice is that you start on a note of the tonic triad. You start on scale degree 3. You'll notice that it's mostly stepwise motion. We have 2 leaps in a row down, and it outlines a major triad. Notice this big leap up gets filled in. And an overall kind of arch-like contour, making it very easy to sing. And you can do the same thing with these other melodies. They're there for you to kind of look at and get some ideas about as well. Okay, that ends this video.